Tom Eagleton, Lateline.
So does the Australian government consider that joining a campaign of airstrikes against Islamic State militants could be part of its humanitarian mission? Well, earlier this evening, Defence Minister Senator David Johnston joined us from our Parliament House studio. David Johnston, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Tony.
Now, President Obama has begun the process of building a coalition of allies to join military action against Islamic State terrorists. Has Australia been approached?
We haven't been approached yet, other than with respect to humanitarian relief, and of course we've had aircraft participating in dropping vital supplies to people who have been cut off so that we can assist them in company with a number of other allied participants.
Have you been approached informally? Because US officials today have briefed journalists. They expect Australia and Britain will be willing to join the US in an air campaign. Has the government at least been sounded out on this?
Well, we have discussions, and we've just had AUSMIN, and look, our relationship is very close with the Americans, and obviously those discussions would touch on these atrocities, the potential genocide, the mass murders, and all of the things that we're seeing unfolding in Iraq at the moment that give us cause for serious concern. And, you know, that's a topic that we've discussed, and of course we've discussed where this might lead.
Well, it's been reported this afternoon that the Australian government is considering committing 24 Australian Hornet strike aircraft to the campaign. Is there any truth in that?
Well, look, I'm not going to talk about what we might or might not do operationally. Currently, our focus is specifically from a humanitarian perspective. Now, we do have a lot of capability at our fingertips. We did participate in 2003 in delivering ordnance onto the ground from our aircraft. Now we've got, as you've just mentioned, we've got Super Hornets. They're incredibly capable. They're exactly what flies off US aircraft carriers. Now that's an obvious first port of call were we to consider it necessary to participate with our friends and our ally.
Do we have Super Hornets in the region, or are they prepared to go to the region if not?
Well, we're at a high state of readiness. We're at a good state of readiness at all times. Apart from saying that, I wouldn't want to say any more.
But how long, I mean, if we are in a state of readiness, there must be a clear idea how long it would take to shift Australian aircraft to the region, to air bases or aircraft carriers, if that were to be the case. I mean, well, is there, if the readiness is there, how long might it take if the order came through?
Well, Tony, let's just take a step back for a moment. First of all, I think the Americans and most of us would want to see a stable government in Baghdad. And that's not going to occur until the 10th of September, when the new Prime Minister takes over. And if he's inclusive, I think that will make things a lot more visible, tangible and concrete going forward. So we're a long way from that. Secondly, we will need an invitation from the Iraqi government. We'll need to settle rules of engagement. We'll need to do a whole host of things before we start talking about any form of deployment. These things are not just done at the turn of a key, although they may seem as much. So there's a long way to go before we start talking about deploying these sorts of systems into the field.
So that date in September, where a new Iraqi government would be formed, is a first kind of deadline, is it? I mean, you couldn't do anything before that.
Well, can I say the Secretary of Defence and the Secretary of State and Julie Bishop and I discussed that we think it's appropriate that a more inclusive government in Baghdad should be established before we start talking to them about what level of military assistance from the sort of group of allies who are so concerned would start to materialise. It's not just a simple matter of deploying aircraft, flying them in and doing the work. There has to be a very careful, methodical and appropriate permission from the government. All of the I's need to be dotted, the T's need to be crossed.
But we're preparing for those possibilities, clearly.
Well, as soon as we've seen, you know, beheadings, mass executions, genocidal villages wiped out, ethnic cleansing, of course, the ADF immediately realises there is a potential and readiness begins to be developed.
Have you been briefed on the urgency in the situation around the northern Iraqi town of Amirli, where the UN is saying immediate action is needed to prevent the massacre of people from Iraq's Turkmen minority?
Well, I'm aware of what's going on there. The only people that have any real capacity there are the Americans, may I say, and possibly the Kurds. Kojo is also a serious recent development. But look, these are in line with what I've just described. This absolute humanitarian disaster of innocent civilians being slaughtered willy-nilly is something that is concerning not just my Prime Minister, not just Australians, but right across Europe, and of course the Americans and the Canadians are extremely concerned. We're all very, very upset at this development.
Indeed, the Prime Minister's statement today says that Australia's decision will be based on whether there is an achievable overall humanitarian purpose and a clear and proportionate role for Australia. That clearly is not ruling out, although simple humanitarian airdrops, is it? Anything more than, I beg your pardon, it's not ruling out anything more than simple humanitarian airdrops. In fact, it's leaving the way open for airstrikes.
Well, airstrikes are already going on. And those airstrikes...
By Australian forces, I mean.
Well, look, those airstrikes are being delivered for a reason. They're actually preserving civilian lives. Now, if this situation continues, I think it's incumbent upon nations that have a strong, clear and understandable reputation and sense of right and wrong to do the right thing here and assist a stable Iraqi government, if we can get one, to defend itself and to retake and assert some reasonable level of legitimate control over these villages.
In fact, to reform a coalition of the willing, is that really what's being talked about?
Well, I think you might describe it like that. Clearly, that looks like, you know, we have a bit of a difference this time. We've got the European countries, we've got the Brits, the French, the Germans, the United States, of course, the Canadians, but we've also got, I think, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks and the Jordanians. Now that, I think, says a lot about how concerned these countries are, and I think our concern, which is very, very grave, we have grave concerns about what's happening in Iraq, is shared by those surrounding countries.
But that is the, in a sense, the extent of the coalition of the willing that might be in contemplation, all of those countries you just named, is that correct?
Well, and I don't think that's an exhaustive list, may I say.
The last time Australian strike aircraft operated in Iraq, you've mentioned yourself, they had separate rules of engagement. They had separate rules as to where airstrikes should happen and rules governing how they should happen and rules around whether civilian casualties might be in prospect. These rules were different than the Americans had. Would that be the same again if Australian aircraft were committed to these operations?
Well, look, I don't want to speculate on what the actual rules of engagement will be, but let me say this. We pride ourselves in our capacity to avoid collateral and civilian damage. This is one of the first principles that Australia undertakes when it does particularly a counterinsurgency type operation. Civilian casualties are completely a self-defeating event in the overall military objectives that we seek to pursue. Now, we will be strict, firm and legitimate in the way we deploy our assets.
And separate, in a sense, in a command sense to the United States, is that correct?
Well, we always conduct ourselves with Australian sovereignty at the forefront of our minds. We do things according to the way we perceive the law, and the way we do our military business is always with every I dotted and every T crossed.
Yep. The Prime Minister's statement also refers to the potential for danger, that being taken into account. Are there specific dangers for Australian strike aircraft in that region? Are there ground-to-air missiles in the area that need to be considered, or is that not in prospect?
We do extensive risk assessments before we undertake any operations, and we've been doing extensive risk assessments for all of our humanitarian work, as is the normal business as usual course.
Now, the US is seeking target information, it's reported, inside Syria and may expand their operations to attacks in Syria. That's also a possibility. Would Australian forces be permitted to operate outside if given permission from the Iraqi government to operate in Iraq, would it be permitted to also operate outside Iraq in Syrian territory?
Well, a permission from the Iraqi government is obviously not a permission from the Syrian government. The answer to that is, I think, very obviously no. However, I think the Syrian situation is a bit different. That is much more clouded, much more muddied.
Meaning there is no real legitimate Syrian government at this stage?
Well, look, I wouldn't want to speculate about what the Syrian situation is. We'd want to sit down at length with our ally, discuss the circumstances, but let's just remember that the motivation here is the preservation of innocent life. Who knows what's coming over the horizon. Iraq is the focus. We're currently immersed in a humanitarian relief mission there. I think we're actually making a difference in the preservation of innocent lives. You know, I won't speculate on where this is leading, but let me say we are extremely concerned about the conduct we've seen so far.
But the tactical thinking currently is not to exclude the prospect of operations in Syrian territory. Is that correct?
I'm not privy to the tactical operational considerations.
Okay, but this would also be a political consideration. You'd be privy to that. I mean, is that a prospect at all? Because we know the United States is going for Islamic State. They're able just to slip across the border into Syria.
I've told you our consideration is Iraq. Our consideration is humanitarian, and that's our focus at the moment. All of these matters are very much to be considered once we perceive that we have, firstly, an inclusive, legitimate government in Baghdad working to engage us and to give us the sort of permissions we see that we need to enter into Iraq, and that we've discussed this fully with not just the United States but with the other participating countries.
All right, but Australia does go into this not knowing effectively what is over the horizon. That means at some point in the future you're going to have to consider whether or not to commit Australian aircraft or other forces to operations in Syria, doesn't it?
Well, it may mean that. I'm not sure of that, Tony. We do not have a crystal ball here. I've told you what our first priority is. It's the preservation of innocent lives in Iraq. That's our focus. How that plays out, I mean, if I could give you the answer to that, I'd be, you know, a very wealthy person. I'm not. We do things according to what confronts us. Our current focus is humanitarian. You know, this business of can you rule in, can you rule out is really quite unproductive in terms of where this is leading. This is a shocking evolution for Iraq and, may I say, for all of the countries that have got foreign fighters. So domestically we're dealing with the legislation to protect our citizens from what's happening. Secondly, we are talking to our allies saying we are as concerned as you are, and President Obama's words today are very, very clear. This is a cancer, and we are, as I say, concerned, and we will preserve life as of right now from a humanitarian perspective. But we've, you know, with other countries agreed, we must take some action.
All right. The Prime Minister's statement also says Australia is not considering putting combat forces on the ground, meaning ground troops. Does that mean ground troops of any kind? Because we know that the SAS has the capability for long-range reconnaissance. That is an important factor when organising the targeting of difficult sites for combat aircraft. Are the SAS ruled out of this completely? Well,
you want me to editorialise the Prime Minister's commentary, and I'm not going to do that. He said there'll be no combat troops on the ground.
Yeah, and that includes the SAS.
Well, no combat troops on the ground. If you define the SAS as combat troops, that's the answer.
Sure, and is that for now, or is that a permanent decision no matter what happens in the future? Because I'm wondering whether the SAS are, like the other elements of Australian forces, being prepared for the possibility.
I'm talking about the now, and speculation as to what we might do in the future is really quite unproductive when we're talking about capability.
So just a quick question then. The contingency obviously is there if the SAS is capable of doing this. Have any SAS forces been moved into the region?
Look, we have a number of people, ADF personnel, deployed across the region, and I'm not prepared to discuss where and what they're doing. The fact is that we have a base at Al Minhad. We have a number of personnel in Afghanistan. We have excellent relationships across the region. We have a number of Middle Eastern countries with personnel at our staff college. You know, let's not get into who's where and what's happening. That also is something that is operational, and you know, the public really, I don't think, need to know anything other than that we have a very good state of readiness, and our principal focus is on the preservation of innocent lives in Iraq in confronting what is a serious threat there and potentially here.
And finally, to bring you back home briefly, the prospect of buying ready-made Japanese submarines is being considered, evidently. Will that be regarded as a broken promise if 10 submarines are not built in Adelaide at some time in the near future?
Well, as I said in the Senate today, submarines are a very complex and expensive, necessary strategic deterrent for Australia. We are committed to a new submarine. We have about 40 submarine designers in Australia, so we will need to have a foreign design. Potentially, the foreign design can come for diesel-electric submarine from France, from Germany or from Japan. We have not made a decision. We are still working through what is probably Defence Acquisition's most complex program. May I say that when I opened the box entitled C-1000, the new submarine, it was empty. It was empty. So we are virtually starting with a clean slate. Now, the United States electric boat up in Grocon have almost 1,000 design engineers. The Germans have about 500 or 600. The French have a similar number. We've got about 40. Now, seriously, this problem needs to be addressed. We are working very hard. The fact is that my immediate priority is the air warfare destroyer, which is several $100 million over budget and several years late. That, again, has been bequeathed to us by a previously extremely incompetent Labor government.
All right, a quick final question though, because we know that Japanese technicians and officials have visited the shipyards in Adelaide. Are they looking at whether or not those shipyards could make part of a Japanese submarine for use in Australia? For example, a propulsion unit or something of that nature.
What we've had is 16 Japanese defence science technicians visit Adelaide. They'll be visiting Perth and they'll be visiting Canberra. Now, we've had French technicians, we've had German technicians, we've had members of the United States Navy and Electric Boat visit us in Adelaide, and this is business as usual. We signed a Defence Science and Technology exchange agreement with the Japanese. This is all part of that. Hydrodynamics is a very important consideration, but we're getting assistance from the French, we're getting assistance from the Germans, the Brits and the United States. So there is nothing, and it's certainly not secret. I mean, I love this business about secret. Anything to do with defence appears to be secret. It's very open. The fact that everybody knows about it means it's not secret. And I'm very pleased and honoured to see the Japanese down here. Our relationship is going very, very well.
David Johnson, we thank you very much for taking the time once again to come and join us on Lateline.
Pleasure, Tony.